He's not like the other lords. Doran Martell is one of George Martin's most unique characters. In a world of devious, scheming rats like Littlefinger, or powerful, vain, cruel lords like Tywin Lannister, or ambitious lords like Mace Tyrell, we've got to put Doran Martell in a class of his own. He's slow to raise an army or pick a side, he's cautious when making plans, and he fiercely loves his family. But he's also not afraid to send his loved ones into dangerous waters. He's complicated, he's intelligent, and he's human. I group Doran Martell with characters like Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, and Edmure Tully. An odd bunch, but George makes them similar in a lot of ways. So I want to discuss what makes Doran Martell special, what his plans are for the Winds of Winter, and how they might unfold. This video is brought to you by my patrons. If you enjoy my channel and want to support me further, you can join for $5 per month. I post all my videos there early and ad-free, plus progress updates and some other stuff. Thanks to everybody whose names are right here, and to all of you as well. Doran's most obvious departure from Westerosi standards is his lack of systemic misogyny, although this is a Dorne thing, not a Doran thing. Ever since the Rhoynar immigrated from Essos, Dorne has set women equal to men, but that doesn't mean misogyny is unheard of. Arianne Martell, despite being Doran's eldest child and thus his heir, fears that her father means to supplant her with Quentyn, her younger brother. There's still an underlying notion that even a Dornishman probably prefers a male heir rather than a female. But Arianne is wrong, and the Martells don't operate that way. Doran and Oberyn grew up under a ruling princess of Dorne, their mother. She taught Doran to see the innocent children of the Water Gardens, both highborn and lowborn, as his true realm, and to keep them in mind above all else. That means you never begin a war you don't think you can win. Oberyn doesn't always treat women very well. For example, he fathered Obara on a sex worker from Oldtown and then slapped the mother in her face, took Obara away from her, and she drank herself to death within a year. That's the sort of story you'd expect of a Tywin Lannister or Roose Bolton, or really any Westerosi lord. But Oberyn was inconsistent. He assaulted his baby mama and sent her into a suicidal depression, but he did it because he wanted to keep his daughters close. He taught all of his girls how to defend themselves, taught Tyene how to extract venom out of snakes to use as poison, taught Obara how to fight with a spear, presumably armed Sorella with a lust for knowledge, etc. Well, Doran hasn't taught Arianne how to use a spear or concoct poison. He's taught her how to rule, how to play politics, something the Sand Snakes are terrible at. Arianne doesn't see it at first. While Doran ostensibly leaves her in charge of Sunspear while he's away at the Water Gardens, Arianne thinks her only responsibilities are feasts and frolics. Doran's cousin is the Castellan, Ricasso is the Seneschal, Alice Ladybright is Master of Coin. By the way, the only female Master of Coin in Westeros. Even a Targaryen princess, Elena, couldn't be named Master of Coin over her own bird-brained husband, despite the fact Elena was doing the job anyway. And of course, Oberyn was placed above everyone. But I'd argue Doran just wanted to immerse Arianne in the day-to-day governance of Dorne, watching and learning from Sir Manfrey and Ricasso and Ladybright rather than having to be in charge herself. Partly so that Arianne can learn the ropes, but partly, I think, because Doran doesn't trust her. Doran Martell is probably the least trusting man in Westeros. He's full of love and leniency for Ellaria and the Sand Snakes and Arianne, but I think Oberyn was the only person he truly trusted. He never told Arianne about the marriage pact he'd arranged after Robert's rebellion. She'd marry Viserys and become his queen in exchange for Dorne's help in a Targaryen restoration. Oberyn arranged the pact with Willem Darry and the Sea Lord of Braavos, but Arianne was never told until A Feast for Crows at age 23. Doran also didn't trust Arianne with his ongoing slow play against the Lannisters. If he'd told Arianne about his plans for revenge, she wouldn't sympathize with the Sand Snakes and the majority of Dornish citizens who call him weak, and she wouldn't have initiated her Queenmaker plot to spark war with the Iron Throne, resulting in a Knight of the Kingsguard's death and Princess Myrcella's ear being cut off. So we, the reader, must ask ourselves, does this mean Doran was wrong to keep Arianne in the dark? That he could have prevented this by trusting her more? Or did Arianne's failed Queenmaker plot only prove Doran correct, that Arianne wasn't ready to be trusted as he had trusted Oberyn? Honestly, both statements are probably true. For all his intelligence and forbearance and respect for all his people, Doran isn't the best communicator, a trait he has in common with a couple of my other favorite characters. But I'll discuss that later. Regardless, Doran does trust Arianne now. She forces his hand by telling him about the letter she found, when Doran told Quentyn that one day he'd be the Prince of Dorne. Of course, Arianne would have been the queen consort of Westeros. So Doran explains all, explains that his mission is, and has always been, justice for Elia and her children, fire and blood. Phase 2 of that plan is currently in effect. Quentyn must find Daenerys in the east, seal their alliance with marriage, and restore House Targaryen to the Iron Throne. Or I should say Phase 2 is now complete, because now there is another Targaryen. Arianne's plot in the Winds of Winter concerns a covert mission to meet Aegon Targaryen, if he truly is Elia's son, and to decide the fate of Dorne. I think there's a really interesting facet of Doran Martell's character here. The people he loves and trusts the most are the ones he puts directly into harm's way. He sent Oberyn in his own stead to take a seat on the small council, to take the measure of King Joffrey and his lords, to see if there were any allies to be had in King's Landing, and to learn whatever he could about their sister Elia's death. This ended in Oberyn's death, obviously. Doran didn't tell him to do all that, but he did send him into harm's way, knowing his brother's provocative nature. He sent Quentyn on a covert mission to Meereen, hoping he could bring Daenerys and her dragons to Dorne. He didn't tell Quentyn, and hey, if you get an opportunity to tame one of her dragons yourself, see what you can do. But anyways, the mission did end with Quentyn's horrific death. Does George Martin have the same ending in mind for Arianne? Another horrific death in service of Doran's scheming? It would be some great irony if over-the-hill, infirm, gouded-up Doran manages to outlive both his younger siblings and all of his children. Or maybe Trystane at least will survive. He's just hanging out in Sunspear. Hey, maybe this was Trystane at the end of Game of Thrones, and this other Trystane was just a paid actor to keep the real Trystane safe. Based on preview chapters for the Winds of Winter, which are a decade old at this point and are certainly subject to change, we know that Arianne is sending her father ravens with intel. Pretty soon, Doran will know that Jon Connington and Aegon have taken Storm's End, and mean to defeat the approaching Tyrell army to prove their cause to Doran. We also know that Arianne has the power to send Dorne to war. They have two armies at the ready, one in the Boneway and one in the Prince's Pass. If Arianne sends the word war, it means to wait. If she sends the word dragon, it means march. March on who, though? Well, you know by now that I think Aegon and the Golden Company will strike west at Euron Greyjoy in the Reach to make common cause with the Tyrells or the Tarleys and to prove himself a worthy king, like his namesake Aegon the Conqueror. It would go a lot smoother for Aegon if he has these two Dornish armies with him. But how will Arianne decide that she can trust them? She held Rhaenys once but doesn't even remember it, and she'll have no idea if Aegon is who he says he is. She'll have to make her decision based on the character of Aegon and her own judgment of his chances to win. Just as Doran's mother told him never to start a war he cannot win, that advice lives on in Arianne now. Personally, I like the idea of Aegon fulfilling the vacant place within her heart that Viserys might have filled, had Doran's original plan worked out. She only just found out about the marriage pact, and she won't have to spend too long mourning the silver-haired, purple-eyed king she never got to marry. She can just marry this one, uniting houses Martell and Targaryen, just as her aunt Elia did when she married Rhaegar. George spends a decent chunk of Arianne's chapters writing about her jealousy over Quentyn, and the trust their father seemingly places in him but not in her. After learning about Quentyn's true mission, she worries she'll have to bend the knee to him one day. She does love him and wishes to see him again, but it's complicated like that. All of George Martin's best characters are conflicted. So maybe Arianne will marry Aegon to supersede Quentyn, that she'll be the royal consort rather than him. Or, I think it's more likely that the absence of Quentyn and Daenerys will tell Arianne that his mission was a failure, or even that Drink and Arch will return to Dorne with Quentyn's bones. Arianne wonders if Daenerys will be mad like her father was, and if she believes Dany had a part in Quentyn's death, that's all the more reason she'd want to marry Aegon and support his claim over Dany's. While Arianne contemplates marriage and war in the Stormlands, Doran will be mourning his son in Dorne. He's a reasonable guy, and will probably understand that Quentyn's death was his own fault, unless Drink tries to lie and blame it on Daenerys. We know from Book 5 that Drink blamed it on Dany when speaking to Barristan. My honest belief is that all of this was just set up for a second dance of the dragons between Aegon and Daenerys, which Martin said would be the subject of a future book. That was in 2003 though, 2 years before Feast, 8 years before Dance, and 13 years before Winds surely releases later on this year. In a second dance scenario, House Martell would be split just as House Targaryen is split. Aegon and Arianne on one side, and Daenerys and Quentyn on the other. But I think George is going to have to simplify this in The Winds of Winter, so he killed Quentyn and Dance, and added in some foreshadowing in Tyrion's chapters for the death of Aegon. Instead of being killed by Dany in a civil war, he'll die in the battle against Euron because he didn't keep his dragon close. He tried to conquer without Dany, and failed to realize that they were stronger together. I want to go back to Doran though. I have noticed that he's quite similar to 3 of my other favorite characters, Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, and Edmure Tully. This quartet basically share an ethos, and I think George wants us to consider all of them good people. Whether they win or lose, ultimately they are righteous, and that's what matters. The trait setting these 4 apart from other Westerosi lords is their respect for small folk lives. They don't view common people as laborers who grow their food and fight their wars, but instead they see common people as actual human beings. Imagine that.
That's interesting.
Even in a feudal society where the very few have absolute power over everybody else, these 4 nobles show respect for their constituents. The bar is a centimeter off the ground, but they clear it. For Doran, this is obvious. We have that quote from his mother and the Daenerys of Dorne, who the Water Gardens were built for. Those children are Doran Martell's people, and among them are small folk. They pay the price when High Lords play the Game of Thrones, so Doran is very meticulous about his revenge. Instead of bloodying all of Dorne in open rebellion against the Baratheons and Lannisters and Starks after Elya's death, and instead of sending an army to King's Landing after Oberyn's death, Doran Martell waits for an opportunity that he believes he can win. Our Daenerys also lives by these rules, and considers all the people of Slaver's Bay to be her people. A queen belongs not to herself, but to the realm. Highborn or lowborn, it doesn't matter to Daenerys. She is just like her great-great-great-grandaunt while knowing almost nothing about her. Dany didn't grow up with a maester who could teach her history, only a brother. I've always loved this line because, for one, it makes you remember how impressive Dany is for having so few resources all her life besides an abusive older brother. And also because it directly contrasts her to Aegon, the secret prince who grew up in Illyrio's estate and has his own septa and maester who've taught him everything he needs to know. All Daenerys had was her intuition, her resolve, and her magic. This contrast between Dany's and Aegon's youths might have added some extra flavor to that potential second Dance of the Dragons George was setting up, which I believe he scrapped. Jon Snow believes in protecting the common people as well. He literally dies for it. Yeah, the mutineers stab Jon after he announces his plan to save Arya from Ramsay, thus breaking his vows, but do we really think Jon's murder had nothing to do with him letting thousands of wildlings through the wall? They hated him for not hating the free folk, since Jon was able to see that they were just normal people like him, people who don't deserve to get killed and necromancied into zombies simply because they live on the wrong side of a wall that was built thousands of years ago. And it's also worth noting that despite growing up a High Lord's bastard in a great castle, Jon has spent several years considering lowborn folks like Pyp and Gren and Satin his true friends. Daenerys, sadly, doesn't have any true friends except for Missandei, her little scribe, but she loves Missandei so much that she wants to reunite her with her family, and she hates Draco and Mago so much for what they did to Arroway, an innocent peasant girl, that she is currently on a quest to kill them. And people don't talk enough about Edmure Tully. Game of Thrones portrays him as a buffoon for his only defining character trait. In the books, Edmure led hundreds of small folk inside the walls of Riverrun, as the Lannister army was raiding nearby fields and villages. Catelyn says, "Who are all these folk?" And Edmure says, "My people, they were afraid." He makes the hard choice of surrendering Riverrun to Jaime Lannister in order to, once again, save his people, hundreds of which would have been killed during the storming. Thinking back on the memories he'd made in Riverrun as a child with Lysa and Cat and Littlefinger, Edmure says, "You will never know how sick it makes me to see you in this room, Kingslayer. You will never know how much I despise you." That line isn't really relevant to the point I'm making, but from now on, please respect Edmure Tully. So you get my point about why these characters are so similar. How many other Westerosi highborn would give 2 figs about a peasant girl being raped, let alone to follow through on a promise of revenge years later? In fact, some highborn folks are the ones doing the raping. And how many would give 2 figs about the wildling's safety, or ever be caught dead making friends with a guy called Gren, or a former male sex worker like Satin? How many would let peasant children play in the water with their own noble offspring? And how many would delay acts of revenge for their own felled family members at the expense of lowborn casualties? These aren't rhetorical questions, by the way. Even though I'm grouping these 4 specifically together, Arya shares these traits as well. She cares about Micah and Hot Pie and Weasel, and she thinks people who abuse other people should die. She's got a whole list of them. But she's just not really in a position of power to do anything about it, not yet at least. Whereas Doran Martell, Jon, Dany, and Edmure are powerful figures who still devote their lives to helping the common person. I also want to draw a connection between Doran and Jon in terms of their usage of harsh love. Decisions that end up hurting those closest to them, but decisions that were done for the right reasons. Jon Snow loves Sam and Gilly, but he was harsh when he took Gilly's baby and replaced him with Mance's. His reasoning was righteous. Mance's baby, as the blood of a king, might get burned alive as a sacrifice to R'hllor by Melisandre. But Gilly's baby is just a normal baby, except for his grandpa is also his dad. So if Melisandre wants to burn him, Jon will just tell her it's pointless. Doran shows harsh love to his own family. He sent Oberyn on a mission that ended in his death, and did the same to Quentyn, and might be doing the same to Arianne. He uses his children as political tools, as all Westerosi lords do, but rather than simply marrying them off to whoever gives Doran the best dowry or alliance, he arranges marriages for the betterment of all Dorne. He's leading by example, basically. Arianne must marry Viserys so Dorne can have revenge for Elia and her children and restore their national power. Quentyn must marry Daenerys so she'll bring her dragons west and Dorne can have revenge for Elia and her children and restore their national power. Having a Martell as royal consort would not only dignify the whole country, but also help get local matters solved quickly at the federal level. And now Arianne might marry Aegon for all those same reasons. Doran loves her and respects her, so he sends Arianne into the middle of a war to do reconnaissance on Jon Connington and Aegon Targaryen. Say what you will about his parenting skills, at least he's putting his family where his mouth is and sending them into danger rather than disposable servants. Joffrey wants Bran dead, so he sends an assassin to do it. Robert wants Dany dead, so same thing, he sends an assassin. Doran Martell wants somebody dead, he activates the Red Viper, who sort of succeeded, and also his own children, in order to achieve those deaths. There are some legitimate critiques people have about Doran's decision-making. First, why did he arrange the Viserys-Arianne pact, and then give Viserys and Dany zero help during their childhood? If Doran's plan for revenge hinged on putting Viserys on the Iron Throne, you'd think he might use some of his connections in Essos, or send some folks from Dorne to watch over the Targaryen kids, sort of like how Aegon has his little crew of Westerosi caretakers. My honest take is that Doran never planned for this marriage to go through. Remember, he'll only start a war he thinks he can win. Would Dorne, plus maybe a few sellsword companies they're able to hire, plus maybe a few other Targaryen loyalist houses of Westeros, be able to win a rebellion against the Baratheon Stark, Lannister, Tully, Arryn bloc? Probably not. But Doran's logic at the time was probably that if the marriage alliance had worked out, and Viserys became relatively normal and married Arianne, you never know what the temperature of Westeros will be. Doran was putting a few eggs into the Viserys basket on the off chance a rebellion was likely to be successful by the time Viserys became an adult. Second, he's lame for not getting revenge for Elia and her kids. It's true that, if he really wanted to, Doran could have allied with Renly, and thus the Reach, to make very quick work of the Lannisters. Renly already had the largest army in Westeros, and if he had the Dornish on his side as well, perhaps he wouldn't have split his forces at Bitterbridge and rode off to face Stannis at Storm's End, which ended in his death. An even larger army might have convinced Renly to simply assault King's Landing as soon as possible, without putting down Stannis first and claiming the smaller army that supported him. Or he could have dispatched a Dornish platoon to break Stannis' siege of Storm's End. Or Doran could have allied with Stannis, I suppose, betrothing Trystane to Shireen. You might argue Doran would favor the Baratheon with the rightful claim, but I'd remind you that Doran would choose whoever has the best chance of winning, in order to minimize Dornish casualties. Another option would have been allying with the Reach directly, setting aside their two nations' historical feud. A marriage between Willis and Arianne would do nicely, and if Mace Tyrell had Dorne on his side after Renly's murder, he may be tempted to keep fighting the Lannisters rather than join them. It does raise the issue, though, of who they're fighting for. Once they depose Joffrey, who becomes king? Mace the Ace himself? Or would Mace and Doran switch gears to Stannis? That's all horribly confusing and uncertain if you're Doran Martell. If you ask me, he chose the best outcome of all, chilling in the Water Gardens watching the rest of Westeros tear each other apart while not having to sacrifice any Dornish lives. And if that skull that Balon Swan presents to Doran really is the Mountain Skull, then the Martells achieved direct justice for Elliot anyways, and Tywin, the Mountain's boss, has already been killed. Doran has outlived all his enemies, so you can't really call him a failure. By the way though, I'm not certain this is the Mountain Skull. Robert Strong exists. Although I do doubt their ability to find another 7-foot-tall monster in Westeros whose skull they could send in the Mountain's place. So perhaps Qyburn found a way to animate the Mountain with a gushy head sloshing around up there. Third, he chose to send Oberyn to the small council in King's Landing and Quentyn on a perilous journey across the world to woo Daenerys. On paper, you'd probably have more success flipping their roles. Quentyn or Arianne can do a serviceable job of learning about Joffrey and his council, seeking Dornish allies at court, and learning any new information about Ellia's death. But neither of them would have volunteered to fight the Mountain, resulting in Oberyn's death. To be fair to Oberyn, his poison did kill the Mountain as well, only Qyburn's necromancy is able to bring him back, sort of. On the flip side, Oberyn the Red Viper is famously charismatic and beautiful and dangerous, essentially a Dornish Daario Naharis, and would be a far more appealing marriage prospect to Daenerys compared to plain, boring old Quentyn. However, let's be fair to Doran here. How is he supposed to know the type of man Dany is attracted to? Wouldn't you figure that a 16-year-old girl who has already been sold into marriage with a man way older than her once before would probably rather marry a guy her own age, Quentyn is 18, rather than a guy who was peers with her father's murderer? Oberyn was like 42 years old. He was around 26 already when Dany was born. So maybe sending Oberyn to King's Landing was a bad choice, but sending Quentyn to woo Daenerys wasn't that stupid. And even if Doran had sent Oberyn, Dany might be tempted, and she might even sleep with him, unfortunately. But let's remember that Dany doesn't refuse Quentyn simply because he's boring and frog-like. He came too late, because she'd already married Hizdahr, because her focus is on securing peace in Slaver's Bay and eradicating slavery. Westeros has to wait. So my point in making this video is that I support Doran Martell's political aptitude. Simply by not being hasty, he's outlived his sister's killers without losing a ton of Dornish life. And with Nymeria situated on the small council, and Tyene infiltrating the Sept of Baelor, he's got shooters on the inside who can kill Cersei or Tommen or Myrcella, if you think that's germane. I'd argue that Tommen and Myrcella are innocent children who don't deserve being murdered for murders that happened before they were born. In The Winds of Winter, Doran might go to war for Aegon Targaryen in the hopes that Arianne will become queen consort, but I guess we'll see who ends up dying for all that. Probably lots of people. Let's not forget that George Martin is basically a hippie who conscientiously objected from Vietnam, and one of his core themes in A Song of Ice and Fire is how the cost of war is so rarely worth the price. In a world of Tywin Lannisters and Ramsay Boltons and Mace Tyrells, a guy like Doran Martell stands out, and I think that's a good thing. Let me know down in the comments why you think I'm soy for hating fictional wars, and what you think Dorne will accomplish, if anything, in The Winds of Winter and beyond. Thanks for watching and subscribing.